Hey guys, this is Adwukta, ADWCTA, and it is August 7th. We're continuing our analysis of how the arena meta is going to change with the Grand Tournament cards, and I am here today to review everything that's been revealed this week, including the big reveal that was, I guess, 2 days ago by this point, and also what was revealed starting from Sunday, which I realized we released that video on Monday, but it didn't cover Sunday's reveal because I recorded it beforehand. More importantly, in the Gamecom reveal for Blizzard, they revealed this new mechanic. It is called Joust, and I'm going to put a card up here. There's a bunch of cards about it, but I just want to make. We're going to look at the Master Jouster here to kind of get a sense of first what Joust is. This is going to be a long video. This is going to be at least an hour long, and I'll break it up into half, because there's just really a lot of ground to cover. We are now at 60, more than 60 out of 120 something cards. So we almost have half the cards revealed now. We have a kind of a good sense of what TGT is about and what it's going to do. And we could really go a lot deeper than we were able to before. So let's talk about the Joust mechanic. What is Joust? Joust is, as you can see, reveal a minion in each deck. It has to be a minion, can't be anything else. And if yours costs more, this is very key, yours has to cost more mana than your opponent's. Then you gain Taunt and Divine Shield for this particular card. For another card, it may have a different function. Now, I'm going to go with three things that are an arena focus, what jousting means for the arena. All right. The first one is that in the arena, your decks are pretty similar to your opponents. A fast deck is something like every card is on average like half a mana lower, maybe at most 1 mana lower than a slow deck. It's not that big of a difference. In Constructed, you can make these like control decks where the only minions I have are 5 mana or more. You don't do that in the arena. You don't get that opportunity. You just lose because you need small minions to play the board in the beginning, even when you're playing a control deck. So it's much less. In Constructed, you have much more control over how good this ability is. In the arena, you have much less control. And what does much less control mean? It means whenever you play this, it's going to be RNG. It was always going to be RNG no matter when you play it, but now it's going to be very close to 50% RNG. It's not actually 50%. That's the other thing I want to talk about. It's less than 50% because most of your manas are going to match up. You will have a ton of 3-drops and a ton of 4-drops. So for the most part, you would actually have to beat your opponent by 1 mana to get this to trigger, which means I think they did some math. Some guy did some math on it on Reddit, and it comes out to something like 40% or something. But it's not 50%. You're going to lose more jousts than you're going to win, which is kind of sad because in theory you should win as many jousts as you lose if they're equal. But in this case, if you have equal mana, it's not like flip a coin, you just lose. So you can't think, when you're valuing these cards, you can't really value them as if half the time you're going to get this battle cry. You're not. And even more importantly, if the battle cry fundamentally changes the function of a card, and especially if it's high cost, you can't even play that card because that's a 50% chance that you ruin it, that you ruin your own play, and the play totally flips on you, and you are no longer able to remain in control. As a good player, you want to limit that RNG. You don't want to expand that RNG. If you're just winning like 2-3 games a run, fine. The RNG kind of works in your favor as much as it hurts you. But from the perspective of an infinite player, this is very bad. This is the opposite of the type of kind of swing that something like an Inspire card would play, right? Because you know what's going to happen with Inspire. You have no control over this. So that's how the jousting mechanic is going to work in TGT. It's the balance of the Inspire mechanic. And I'll go over this. There's other ways in which it balances the Inspire mechanic. But the whole idea is that this is the GVG aspect of TGT, right? GVG added a lot more random elements than people were generally comfortable with before that. This is the random element here, jousting. I'm not a big fan of the system. Like I said, it's RNG, and the game doesn't really need more RNG. And on top of that, I understand that in Constructed, it rewards decks that are control, and control needs a boost, and Blizzard wants a more control meta. In the arena, it's just going to add more RNG, and it makes certain cards very big swing cards, and so I'm not a big fan of it. And it's not even a good, it doesn't make a card generally good. So let's look at some cards with Joust so we can get a little more specific instead of talking in these generalities. The first thing, the one that I think Blizzard revealed first, is Master Jouster, and you see here it's 6 mana for a 5/6 with Taunt. That should be something like 5.5 mana, right? A 5/6 with Taunt. You could probably even argue that it's actually just worth 6 mana. It doesn't have Taunt. It's just a 5/6, so that's worth 5 mana. It would be a really good 5 mana card. They add an extra mana, and for this extra mana, you either get Taunt and Divine Shield, which would be insanely good, right? That would be, I don't know, what's a Sunwalker? A 4/5 for 6 mana? This is a 5/6 for 6 mana, so it'll cost at least 7 mana, probably like 7.5 mana. And on the other hand, if you don't get it, it should cost 5 mana. So the swing here is 1.5 mana of gain, and about 1 mana of loss. That's not that big of a swing when you're already spending 6 mana of a card, right? The card's worth 6 mana, and so a 1 mana swing down or a 1.5 mana swing up, which by the way matches the percentages very nicely of how often you're going to win a Joust, is not great. It's not, I mean, not great. It's not a great effect. It's not a very positive effect if you trigger it. It's not a very negative effect if you trigger it. It does create the situation where you can't reliably play it as a taunt, which again, if you're a good player, you know how to play a taunt. You know when taunts are good. If you're a bad player, you don't really care. You just kind of want to get value out on the board. So this screws over good players compared to bad players. But even then, it's not the biggest effect. Now you compare this, and I'm going to go to one more card where it's also a small effect, right? Like Tuskar Jouster. It's a 5 mana for a 5/5, perfectly fine stats, and you could gain 7 health. It's generally useful to get 7 health. You probably want it. If you're counting on it to save your life, it's a little iffy, but if you're counting on it to save your life, you'd play it anyway, because there's not a lot of cards that you may have in your hand that would save you if you really need the life. And if you're debating between this and a taunt to save your life, you'd play the taunt, because you don't want to take the chance. And so this card generally functions the way you think it would function without a huge effect. The RNG, even though you can't control it, it doesn't cause you to make these gambles, right? It's like it could save you or it could not. That's kind of all it does. Even the Master Jouster, maybe you would just want to play a bigger minion if it couldn't get taunt, right? Maybe you're trying to protect a minion, but you can't make those decisions anymore with the Joust mechanic. It's all thrown up in the air into randomness. So Tuskar Jouster is probably the best jousting card. Not as in it's the highest rated jousting card, but as in it's the most fair, it's the least RNG jousting card. Master Jouster is okay as well. Like we said, the swing's not that big, but it does affect its usage. But when you go down the list now, the usage effect that I'm talking about is going to have these huge swings. Look at an Armored Warhorse. What's a 5/3 for 4 mana? It's totally worthless because it dies to a 3/2. It dies to most 2 mana removals. It'll die to a Fiery War Axe, which will have another charge even. It's an awful card. On the other hand, if it has charge, it's better than it's even better than a Reckless Rocketeer, which is 6 mana. That's a huge swing for just a 4 mana card to either get so much use out of it or to get a really awful body on the board. And worst of all, you're not going to play charge minions generally in the same instance that you would want to just drop a big thing, or like I guess a mid-sized thing. You cannot call a 5/3 big. So if you're a player who knows when to play cards, you're at a disadvantage because you never want to play the Armored Warhorse. You would only play it when you have a backup plan in your hand, which means this has to be like turn 8 or something. You wouldn't be able to reliably play it at any other time. Or you have some weird setup where like you could remove what's on the board anyway, but if you got an Armored Warhorse, you'd trade that in. It's very situational to be able to even play it. On the other hand, if you're a bad player, why not, right? Just throw it on the board, see what happens, do what you do. So this is a card that I would recommend almost no good players take. It will be rated very low on our tier list. Not like, maybe not in the 30s, but it's definitely below a 50. And it gets, I don't know if this is worse, but it's a similar effect, right? Can you play Gadgets and Jouster on turn 1? Well, would you play a 1/2 on turn 1? Maybe, maybe not. You would certainly rather coin out a 2 and play another 2 rather than play a 1/2. Whereas if you had a 2/1 and your opponent can't ping, you may just play the 2/1 and save your coin. But a 1/2 is kind of just a bare minimum tempo play. It's a pretty bad card. We rate 1/2 as like barely above 10. On the other hand, a 2/3 on turn 1, that'll swing a game. That's a zombie chow that swings a game. So you either end up basically down a card, or you end up having a really high chance of winning the game because you just got a zombie chow and it can even deal damage to the face without healing your opponent. That is a huge swing. And it's something that will screw over good players and will screw over bad players alike. This isn't really a good player, bad player thing, but it does affect. If you're a good player, oftentimes, if you know what your opponent's doing or you have a good read or your opponent doesn't, you just wouldn't play a 1-drop. But now you're kind of like, well, you got like a 40% chance to be really good. So if you have a Gadget and Jouster, obviously you do play it on turn 1, right? No matter what situation it is, you will just throw this thing out on the board. But then you gotta hope. So. Is it a good card? Yes, it is a good card. Any chance you can get to get close to a zombie chow is a good card. But it's not a great card, and it does have an RNG element. And we penalize RNG elements. We have always penalized it. The Shredder would be incredible. I know we have it rated very high. It should be rated way higher than that if we weren't penalizing it for RNG. But it's penalized for RNG for a good reason, right? If a card will win you half the games and lose you half the games, that's not good if you win 7 games on average and lose 3 games on average. That's okay if you win 3 games on average and lose 3 games on average. And that's amazing for you if you win 1 game on average and lose 3. So it kind of all depends. And we build our tier list and do everything from the perspective of an infinite player. So all those RNG cards are kind of scaled down a bit by the degree in which their RNG is controllable. Something like that, not controllable. It's jousting. Definitely not a fan of this mechanic. I understand it's exciting for the game, and Blizzard has to do stuff like that, and it's good for the constructed meta, but it's one of those places where Arena doesn't need this. Let's talk about Mukla's Champion. I kind of just stuck this in here. I don't really know where to put it. It doesn't quite fit a theme. You see, we have a list, like, over here that kind of lists out the themes that I have built in, and that line is where we're going to cut the first video off. But this doesn't really fit anything, so I just stuck it in here. It's another Inspire card, but this is an interesting Inspire card in that it gives your other minions 1/1. Normally cards get inspired, right? Like, oh, this hero's doing something so cool with his hero power, I'm going to gain extra attack and extra defense. I don't really know how it works. But this says, oh, the hero's doing so much work, I will now lead my people better. I don't know. Either way, it gives your other minions 1/1. So you need this on the board, you need other minions on the board, then you need to have 2 more mana to use your hero power. It only has 3 health. You don't want to just drop it without using your hero power. This is going back to the first video. This is one of those cards where you kind of have to play it. It's like that Kodo thing where you kind of have to play with the hero power. It's just not worth it not to play with the hero power. And what on turn 7, which is when you can play with the hero power, what on turn 7 gives all your other minions +1/+1? That's a Stormwind Champion. That's really good. But a Stormwind Champion is also a 6/6 body, not a 4/3 body with, at best, like a mage ping or something. So this is definitely not a good card. It's very situational, and I know there's always this contingent of people that like really like something like Enhanced Mechano. It's kind of like that in that it's not good. At least it's not random. It's better than Enhanso, just for the fact that it's not random. But the board setup has to be kind of very specific for you to get good value out of that. Whereas for a Stormwind Champion, you have anything on the board, you play a Stormwind Champion, it's kind of already gotten its value. For this, what's 5 mana? That should be like, what, a 6/5? So you need to inspire 2 other minions, and you need to want to play your hero power on that turn anyway. So if Mukla's Champion is going to live a turn, that's fine. You could probably pull it off. If he's not going to live a turn, and he usually won't, he's kind of a big target, it's not going to work out for you. So not a good card. Okay, so now we go to some 1-drops. We already did the Gadget Van Jouster, and we're going to go with a Injured Cavaldier. I don't know how to pronounce that word. It's not a real word. It's a rare card, so you're not going to see it very often. It's a 1 mana 2/1, so you're not going to pick it all that often. And it has the same thing Injured Blademaster does. So you may be thinking, well, you know, at least it's good for a priest, right? Like a priest can heal it up on turn 2, and then you have a 2/3. That's fine, but you've still spent 3 mana to get a 2/3. Like, it's still not a good 2-drop. It is technically a 2-drop because it can replace a 2-drop in function, But it's still you'll always take a River Croc over it, right? Like even though this is 1 mana. Um, and it has possible like combo synergies and things like that that could be really cool with a priest. But generally, you'd rather just spend 2 mana to get something out there. You don't want to spend 1 mana and then lock yourself in. Maybe you have the coin. Maybe you can do something else otherwise. And later on, if you drop this later on, you're never going to heal it. Like you're going to heal something with that only has 2 attack. Probably not. It does allow you to get around a mage ping, so it is better than it's definitely better than a 2/1, especially for a priest. But it's not one of those game-changing 2/1s that you sometimes see. And another not game-changing 2/1 that people are going crazy about in Constructed, but it clearly has very limited arena value. It's just the Inspire mechanic is almost never going to be triggered. In the same way, when you have Quick Shot, the Inspire mechanic, not the Inspire mechanic, the like when your hand is empty, draw a card mechanic is almost never triggered. It's pretty much just a 2/1. We'll give it a tiny bit of extra consideration for it, and it'll scale based on how fast your deck is and whether you can actually get rid of all those cards. But so we saw a couple of 1-drops. They're not terribly game-changing. There's no Zombie Chow in there. There's no Worgen Infiltrator in there. There's not even a Clockwork Gnome in there yet. The 1-drops are well under control. Actually, I don't know. I take that back. Gadget Den Jouster may have the same kind of impact as a Clockwork Gnome. Probably it will. So at around the Clockwork Gnome level, we start getting something. But the downside is really big. And remember, with Jousting, the downside triggers more often than the upside. The upside is like 40%. The downside is 60%. So your odds are not just RNG random. They're actually stacked against you. And now we draw. Okay, so we're getting to the all of the draw cards, and there's been a lot of cards, including one that was just released several hours ago from when we're recording this video, the Grand Crusader, which makes every class a paladin. Battlecry. Add a random paladin card to your hand. 5/5. So basically 5/5 draw a card, except you don't draw the card from your deck. But for the arena, it doesn't matter as much that you don't draw from your deck. It's a paladin card, which is good. Paladin cards are good. They've been adding a ton of great paladin cards. You have Muster, you have Coghammer, you have these new paladin cards. Definitely one of the better classes to be pulling cards from. But one thing to know is that the average class card is lower than the average card that'll be in the deck, and this will come into play with the next card, Burgle, as well. Because when you get offered cards in your deck, you get offered 3, and you only pick 1. And so therefore, you are picking a fairly high value card most of the time. The average card that's picked is something like a 64 rating. The average paladin card is not even a 60, and that's one of the higher classes. So generally, you're going to get a worse card than what I would compare this card to, which is Azure Drake, which is 5 mana, has a +1 spell damage that most people don't use, and is a 4/4. But it draws a worse card. On the other hand, it's a 5/5 body, which is much better than a 4/4 body. And I don't, at least in the current meta. Again, we don't know how the meta is going to change. Maybe everyone will play that armored warhorse, and so everything deals 5 damage and nothing matters anymore. But 5/5 generally in the meta, very good against things, even on turn 6. And that's why something like a Frost Elemental, right? That's a pretty good card. So, although the card it draws is going to be worse than the card Azure Drake draws, and it's going to come out a turn later, I think we're going to end up putting it around where Azure Drake is, if not even higher than Azure Drake. Probably not higher than Azure Drake. It is missing the spell damage, but this is a very good card, like a very good card. And going on with what we were talking about, Burgle, on the other hand, is not a very good card because it suffers the same things as the Grand Crusader that we were talking about, and it doesn't have the upside of dropping a very good for the meta body. It is a Arcane Intellect, and it gives you worse cards than an Arcane Intellect. And you're a rogue too, so you do get to use all the cards. You can't pick up a weapon buff or something that you can't use the way a priest Thought Steal may be able to do. But With a Priest Thoughtsteal, you're still pulling cards from your opponent's deck, and those cards, one, give you information on what else your opponent has, but two, 3 cards your opponent presumably picks with the best card out of the 3, so you're going to get better cards. As with Thoughtsteal, you're going to get even better cards with Arcane Intellect. You're going to get the worst cards with Burgle. And then my favorite card draw card. This is going to be divisive, especially if you talk to like people who are really into the arena meta, right? Ancestral Knowledge. I'm not finding it. There we go. Which is a shaman card. It is heavily overcosted. Overload 2, yeah, it's on the next turn, but Overload usually isn't counted. On the next turn, isn't counted as just half a mana. It's counted as 2/3 of a mana. So the Overload 2 makes it actually more expensive than an Arcane Intellect, than a Burgle, than a Thoughtsteal. It draws 2 cards, the same as an Arcane Intellect. What I like about it is because this is the card that Shaman in the arena has missed since like the very beginning. Shaman was always a weird class where it's able to drop things on the board with its hero power, like just create things out of nothing. But if you don't have the board already, you can't protect them, and they get killed for nothing, and it's as if you tapped just to armor up. On the other hand, if you do get a hit on the board, you can protect your totems, and then you can buff everything, and everything works out well. But people usually use that to play defensively, because you also have Fire Elemental, you have Hex, you have these 2-for-1 or these like major tempo swing cards that allow you to actually win the card advantage game. And the totems are really, really annoying for the card advantage game. You can heal up, you can, swing, you're always kind of in control with your tempo swing cards with like Lightning Storm, Lightning Bolt, Fork Lightning. These are just very mana efficient cards for the turn. So you never quite lose the board once you get it. But what it can never do is it can never draw cards. And if you really want to play a control game, you kind of want to draw some cards at some point, right? You don't want to be behind your opponent. You don't want your opponent to play a card draw card and you go, oh no, all that good trading, all that board stuff, the totems that I've gotten extra value out of with my Flame Tongue, all of that has gone to waste because he just played a card that drew a bunch of cards. And now I have to use one of my Whirlwind or, I don't know, Bloodlust or something like that to like finish the opponent off. So this is going to be a huge game changer, an absolutely huge game changer for the Shaman in the arena. A lot of people talk about the other cards that are actually better than this card, like the 3/4 2-mana totem with Overload, or the which I think I pointed out in the last video. What happens if I play a 3/4 and you have a 3/2? Well, I eat your 3/2, I end up with a 3/1, you then play your 3-drop, I can only play a 2-drop, and what happens, right? Like, it's still an even trade. So it doesn't really get you ahead if your opponent is just playing normally, because you're forced to play a 2-drop again, assuming your opponent has a 3-drop. But this is actually going to change how Shaman can be played. Like once, and because Hearth Arena is already set up this way, once you add this card to Hearth Arena, the Shaman drafting algorithm kind of totally shifts. It recognizes there's this common card now and that these certain strategies are more viable. We don't even have to do anything for something like this, right? It's an existing mechanic in terms of how it changes the archetypes and how it changes all the probabilities. But I've been waiting for this card for a long time for the Shaman, so I'm very excited about it. And we're going to wrap the part 1 of this video right now. Click through, watch part 2 of the video. Part 2 of the video will talk about the new Hobgoblins, which is crowd favorite Master of Ceremonies. It will talk about class convergence, which is something I harp on a lot if you've been listening to my stuff from BRM or GBG. And it's the concept that classes are getting closer together. And we're going to talk about happy curves, which is really just a way for me saying that things are curving out more. And we're going to officially start our Warrior Riot, because it's about time. I promised a Warrior Riot, and I think we're getting to that point. And then we're going to talk a little bit about distribution of cards between the rarities. So stay tuned, click through the next video, and I'll see you guys in a bit.